Billionaire CEO PANICS, without an Arabic translator, until the black waitress takes over and... Gerald Whitmore slammed his fist onto the sleek glass conference table, his voice slicing through the tension like a blade. "You're telling me the interpreter just canceled, 15 minutes before the Saudis walk in?" The assistant flinched, trembling behind her tablet. "Family emergency, sir. I tried calling everyone in the city. No one's available." Gerald paced across the 47th floor of Luxwell Capital's Chicago headquarters, his million-dollar view of Lake Michigan now irrelevant compared to the $300 million deal about to collapse before his eyes. The Saudis were notoriously formal. Language was sacred in their culture. No interpreter meant no meeting. No meeting meant no deal. And no deal meant his 10-year career at the top of the finance world might go up in smoke. All because of a goddamn translator. He pulled at his collar, sweat forming at his temples despite the air conditioning humming overhead. That's when a voice, quiet but unwavering, cut through the chaos. "Excuse me, Mr. Whitmore. I speak Arabic." Every head turned. Standing near the coffee station, still holding a tray of untouched pastries, was Danielle Carter, a catering staff member barely noticed until now. Her voice was calm, eyes steady. "Gulf dialect, formal and conversational. I studied at Stanford." The room went silent. One executive let out a scoff. Another exchanged glances with HR. Gerald blinked, stunned. You're the waitress?" Danielle nodded. "Technically, yes, but not just that." In that moment, no one in the room realized she was about to change everything. Gerald stared at Danielle as if seeing her for the first time. The tray of pastries in her hands suddenly seemed like a prop from a different life. "Stanford?" he repeated, trying to wrap his head around the absurdity of it all. Danielle gave a polite nod. "Middle Eastern Studies. Full scholarship. I had to drop out my junior year when my mom passed. Been working odd jobs since." The room was still frozen, unsure whether to laugh, scoff, or take her seriously. Chloe Green, the firm's PR director, stepped forward with a half smile and sharp eyes. "Gerald, come on! We can't possibly have a—" She hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "A member of the catering team representing us in front of the Saudi delegation. What message does that send?" Danielle didn't flinch. "What message does it send if you cancel a $300 million meeting because no one else in this building speaks Arabic?" Her tone wasn't arrogant. It was matter of fact. Gerald held up his hand, silencing Chloe before she could respond. He studied Danielle for a long second, his mind racing through the logistics, the risks, the optics. But he also saw something in her eyes. Resolve, clarity, intelligence, and most importantly, no panic. "Say something," he said suddenly. "Something in Gulf Arabic." Danielle took a breath and delivered a formal greeting with impeccable pronunciation, then paused, waiting. Gerald didn't understand a word, but the conviction in her voice was enough to make the hair on his arms rise. Chloe crossed her arms. She could be saying anything. "She's not," said a man in the corner. It was Mahmoud, their junior compliance officer, whose father was from Riyadh. He stepped forward slowly. What she just said was textbook perfect. She even used the honorifics. Gerald looked between them, made a decision, and pointed at Danielle. "You've got 10 minutes. Borrow a blazer. You're going in." Danielle didn't hesitate. She gave Gerald a curt nod and turned on her heel, leaving the conference room with her tray still in hand. She made a quick stop by the receptionist's desk, where Ava, the young assistant with a kind heart and a closet full of emergency heels and hairspray, handed her a navy blue blazer and a pair of flats without asking questions. "You're gonna kill it," Ava whispered, eyes wide with excitement. Danielle changed in the restroom in under 3 minutes. Gone was the catering uniform, replaced by slacks, a simple blouse, and the borrowed blazer that somehow fit perfectly. She pulled her curls into a low bun, looked at herself in the mirror, and took a breath. "You've done harder things than this," she murmured. "You've survived worse." And she had, losing her mom, dropping out of Stanford, working 2 jobs to support her little brother while watching classmates post photos of graduation and job offers. But none of them had spent 2 years listening quietly at the edge of boardrooms, observing the way men like Gerald negotiated, the way Chloe spun optics, the way power moved in silence. Danielle had absorbed it all while pouring coffee. Now she was about to use every ounce of it. She stepped back into the executive hallway just as the elevator doors dinged open. 5 men in traditional Saudi thobes and tailored suits walked out with quiet confidence. Their leader, a man in his late 50s with salt and pepper hair and a presence that silenced the room, stepped forward. Gerald greeted him with rehearsed formality and then, gesturing toward Danielle, said, "This is Danielle Carter, our cultural liaison and interpreter for today's meeting." Chloe's jaw clenched. Danielle stepped forward with grace and greeted the delegation in flawless Gulf Arabic, offering the exact phrasing typically used in high-level introductions. The lead delegate, Mr. Al-Mansouri, blinked in surprise, then smiled, a genuine rare smile that meant respect. "Excellent dialect," he said in Arabic, "and rare in someone so young." Danielle bowed her head slightly. "It is an honor to serve in this meeting. I hope to facilitate mutual understanding." As the delegation followed Gerald into the conference room, Chloe leaned toward Danielle and whispered sharply, "Just don't forget you were handing out croissants this morning." Danielle didn't turn to look at her. She simply replied, "And yet somehow, I'm still walking into that room, and you're walking behind me." The conference room was all glass, steel, and tension. Floor-to-ceiling windows bathed the space in cold Chicago sunlight, while a long mahogany table stretched like a battleground between cultures, egos, and millions of dollars. As Danielle took her seat beside Gerald, her heart pounded hard against her ribcage, but her face remained calm, composed, professional, unreadable. Mr. Al-Mansouri and his advisors settled in across from them, their briefcases opening in perfect synchronization. Chloe sat 2 seats away, visibly bristling, occasionally scribbling in a notebook she didn't need. Gerald opened the meeting with the standard welcome, speaking slowly and confidently before turning to Danielle to interpret. She translated with clarity and deference, her tone adjusted perfectly for formal negotiation. From the first sentence, the Saudi delegation responded with visible ease. A few minutes in, Mr. Al-Mansouri leaned slightly forward and made a joke in Arabic about the American obsession with iced coffee. Danielle translated it with the same dry humor, causing the room to ripple with quiet laughter. Gerald shot her a surprised glance. He hadn't expected that level of nuance. For the next 20 minutes, the meeting unfolded like a symphony. Danielle moved between English and Arabic seamlessly, adjusting inflections, simplifying concepts, and occasionally softening phrases that sounded too aggressive when directly translated. She didn't just speak the language, she understood the tone, the culture, the rhythm. It wasn't just communication, it was diplomacy. But just as things were settling into a smooth, productive tempo, Chloe struck. "If I may," she interjected suddenly, leaning forward with a practiced smile, "I think it's only fair to offer some background about our impressive interpreter today." Danielle froze. Gerald's eyes narrowed. Chloe continued, addressing Mr. Al-Mansouri directly. "It's quite the success story. This morning, Danielle was serving coffee in our catering department. But in a twist of fate, and a desperate shortage of translators, she's now sitting here at the table." Her tone was sweet, but every word dripped with condescension. The room went quiet. The Saudis exchanged glances. One of the younger advisors raised an eyebrow, clearly caught off guard. Danielle felt the heat rise in her neck, but she didn't let it show. She met Mr. Al-Mansouri's gaze and spoke in Arabic with calm precision. "In our culture," she said gently, "we say that service is not a mark of status, but of character. I am honored to serve both tea and truth when called." There was a pause. Then Mr. Al-Mansouri nodded solemnly. "Well said," he replied. "Very well said." Chloe sat back, her mouth tight, her attempt at humiliation neatly reversed with a single sentence. Danielle continued the meeting with renewed focus, her voice unwavering, her translations now layered with an extra measure of resolve. Every sentence she spoke became more than just a bridge between languages. It became a statement of competence. She could feel Gerald relaxing beside her, his confidence in her growing with every nod and smile from across the table. But under the polished surface of diplomacy, Danielle sensed a shift. Chloe's interruption had left a mark. The Saudis were still polite, still respectful, but there was a new edge in their demeanor. A subtle formality had returned, a guardedness that hadn't been there before. Danielle knew enough about Arab culture to understand what that meant. Hierarchy mattered. Status was closely observed. And now, the fact that she had been introduced after Chloe's backhanded remark as a former server rather than a professional might have quietly reframed their perception of her, not as a negotiator, but as an anomaly. She filed the observation away and shifted gears. When the delegation posed a question about Luxwell Capital's regional experience in the Gulf, Danielle answered directly instead of waiting for Gerald. "For the past 2 fiscal years," she said in Arabic, "Luxwell Capital has handled cross-border investments in Bahrain, the UAE, and Qatar. We also facilitated a clean energy partnership in Oman, which resulted in a 23% growth in returns for local stakeholders." Mr. Al-Mansouri looked at her, surprised. "You have access to those figures?" "Yes," Danielle answered. "I prepared for this meeting the moment I heard it was happening." Gerald glanced at her, stunned. He hadn't even briefed her himself. How had she known so much? But Danielle had her own way of preparing. 2 years on the service floor meant she had overheard dozens of meetings, studied portfolios left open on coffee tables, absorbed company reports read aloud over Zoom calls she wasn't supposed to hear. While no one looked at her, she was listening to everything. And now, it was paying off. The meeting pressed forward. One of the Saudi advisors, a stern man in his 40s named Tariq, asked a question about local compliance regulations in Illinois. Danielle translated for Gerald, but when he stumbled over his answer, Danielle gently stepped in and offered a concise explanation based on recent legislative changes. The advisor gave her a long look, one that held something more than curiosity. It held consideration, respect. But just as the room began to settle into a new rhythm, Chloe interrupted again. "If I may clarify," she said with an apologetic chuckle, "Ms. Carter's role here is purely linguistic. We certainly don't expect her to handle compliance or legal matters." The smile on her face didn't reach her eyes. Danielle turned to Mr. Al-Mansouri and spoke with calm, deliberate pacing. "In the interest of cultural clarity," she said, "I would like to explain something about our internal structure. While titles may appear rigid, expertise often exists outside the conventional boxes. I do not represent the legal team, but I am prepared. If that is unacceptable, I respectfully step back." She folded her hands in her lap. It was a quiet act of defiance, measured, dignified. Mr. Al-Mansouri leaned toward Gerald. "Tell me," he said in English, "who is truly leading this meeting?" Gerald hesitated. He looked at Danielle, then at Chloe, then back at the Saudis. "That depends," he said slowly. "Do you want the person who's listed on our org chart, or the one who's actually driving this conversation?" Mr. Al-Mansouri smiled. It wasn't wide or dramatic, but it was telling. "I think we already know the answer." At that moment, Chloe paled. Her fingers gripped her notepad a little too tightly. She'd just realized what everyone else in the room already understood. Danielle Carter wasn't just translating words. She was rewriting the balance of power right in front of them. The final hour of the meeting passed like a delicate chess match, each move deliberate, each phrase carefully calculated. Danielle stayed sharp, sensing every shift in tone, every raised eyebrow, every glance exchanged across the table. She translated, clarified, and when needed, explained technical points with such fluid precision that the Saudis no longer looked to Gerald for confirmation. They looked to her, and Gerald noticed. While Chloe sat silently fuming behind her polished exterior, Danielle had become the de facto voice of Luxwell Capital in the room. By the end, the mood was unexpectedly light. Mr. Al-Mansouri even shared a short story in Arabic about a camel trader who accidentally bought his own camel back at double the price. Danielle translated it perfectly, even mimicking the subtle humor in his tone. The room chuckled. Gerald let out a relieved breath, clearly impressed. When the final handshakes were exchanged, Mr. Al-Mansouri held Danielle's hand for an extra second. "You carry both knowledge and humility," he said in Arabic. "That combination is rare and valuable." Danielle bowed her head slightly, offering the customary reply of gratitude. The delegation exited the room, their mood visibly positive. Once the doors closed, Gerald turned to Danielle with wide eyes. "You just saved this company," he said, half in awe. "I don't know how to thank you." Before Danielle could respond, Chloe cut in. "Let's not overstate things. The Saudis were clearly being polite. They'll need time to consider. It's not a done deal." Gerald ignored her. "Danielle, you were flawless," he continued. "I mean, where the hell have you been hiding all this time?" Danielle smiled faintly. "Not hiding, just unnoticed." Chloe scoffed. "Let's be real. This was a fluke, a lucky break. We can't pretend she's qualified to step into meetings like this going forward." Danielle turned to her, voice calm but direct. "You're right. We can't pretend. So let's stop pretending I don't know what I'm doing." Chloe's face tightened. Gerald held up a hand to de-escalate the tension, but the moment hung in the air like electricity. Danielle's phone buzzed in her pocket. She glanced at the screen. It was a message in Arabic from a number she didn't recognize. Translated, it read, "You impressed us. Private dinner invitation tomorrow. Just you. No intermediaries." It was signed, Tariq Al-Mansouri, advisor to the board. Danielle looked up, pulse quickening. The meeting wasn't over. It was just beginning. And she had been noticed, finally, not as help, but as the voice that mattered. Danielle didn't respond to the message immediately. She slid her phone back into her pocket, her mind already running through every possible implication. A private dinner with Tariq Al-Mansouri wasn't just a social courtesy. It was a signal. In business, especially in Middle Eastern culture, personal invitations like that were rarely casual. They were about trust, about intention, about recognizing value beyond a title. Still, she said nothing to Gerald or Chloe as she gathered her notepad and stood from the table. The post-meeting air buzzed with the unspoken. Danielle had carried the room, not just linguistically but strategically. The junior executives who had barely acknowledged her earlier now gave her lingering glances, their expressions tinged with something like newfound respect, or perhaps recalibration. Chloe, however, wasn't ready to surrender her position so easily. As Danielle walked toward the hallway, Chloe followed, her voice tight with forced civility. "That went better than expected," she said, her heels clicking sharply behind her. "Still, I'd be careful. These kinds of moments, they can go to people's heads." Danielle paused at the corner where the hallway split, then turned slowly. "The only thing going to my head," she said evenly, "is the realization that maybe I never needed permission to be at the table." Chloe's eyes narrowed, but before she could answer, Danielle was already walking away. Back in the break room, She slipped out of the borrowed blazer and returned it to Ava, who beamed at her like a proud sister. "You were incredible," Ava whispered. Chloe looked like she swallowed a lemon. Danielle chuckled, but didn't let herself relax. Not yet. She had a dinner to prepare for. That evening, in her modest apartment on the south side, she sat at her tiny kitchen table with a cup of tea, laptop open, research tabs blinking. She didn't just Google Tariq al-Mansouri. She mapped the board members of his firm, the recent mergers they'd initiated, and the legislation affecting foreign investment in Illinois. If he wanted to talk business, she would be ready. And if he wanted to talk opportunity, she'd be more than ready. After all, she had spent the last 2 years listening from the margins. Tomorrow, she intended to speak from the center. The next evening, Danielle arrived at the rooftop restaurant precisely at 7 o'clock. The hostess led her to a private table draped in white linen, set against a panoramic view of the Chicago skyline. The air was crisp, touched with the fading scent of spring rain. Tariq al-Mansouri was already seated, impeccably dressed in a dark suit. No traditional attire this time. He stood as she approached and offered a warm handshake, his expression unreadable but clearly respectful. "Miss Carter," he said in English, his tone polished. "Thank you for accepting my invitation." "It's an honor," Danielle replied. "And thank you for seeing beyond what others rarely do." A slight smile flickered at the corner of his mouth as they sat. For the first few minutes, the conversation was cordial, surface level, food preferences, favorite cities, books. But once their meals arrived, the tone shifted. "You handled yourself with remarkable grace yesterday," Tariq said, folding his napkin deliberately. "Not just the language, but the posture, the restraint, the ability to know when to speak, and when not to." Danielle nodded once. "I've learned that silence isn't absence. It's a choice, especially when people think you don't matter." He studied her face for a moment. "Have you always worked in service roles?" She smiled, not embarrassed, but centered. "Most of my life, yes. But I also studied Arabic literature at Stanford. I didn't finish. Family circumstances. But I never stopped learning." He leaned back, thoughtful. "You know," he said slowly, "we've had concerns about Luxwell's internal structure, some inconsistencies, hidden dynamics that don't align with our values of transparency and merit. Yesterday confirmed what we suspected." Danielle said nothing, waiting. Tariq continued, his voice softer but heavier. "We would like to retain you independently, not through Luxwell, directly, as an international liaison for our U.S. expansion." Her breath caught, but she didn't show it. "Are you offering me a job?" "I'm offering you a transition," he said. "From invisibility to influence, from the margins to the center, and from being tolerated to being chosen." Danielle didn't answer right away. She let the moment breathe. She wasn't desperate, not anymore. She was evaluating. "There's one condition," Tariq added. "We're reviewing Luxwell's contract conduct. We'd like your insight. Quietly. Nothing public. Just perspective." Danielle held his gaze. She thought of Chloe, of years overhearing unethical deals whispered over catering trays, of spreadsheets altered, names removed, opportunities denied to people who didn't fit a certain mold. "I understand," she said, "and I know more than you might expect." Tariq raised his glass. "To clarity, then." Danielle clinked her glass against his. Her hands were steady, her mind even steadier. She wasn't just stepping into a new role, she was stepping into power, and this time, no one would be able to overlook her again. 2 days later, Luxwell Capital was a pressure cooker. The boardroom buzzed with tension as executives filed in, adjusting their ties, flipping through printed agendas they barely skimmed. Gerald stood at the head of the long conference table, his jaw tight, eyes darker than usual. The Saudi delegation had not only delayed signing the deal, they had submitted a formal notice of concern regarding Luxwell's internal transparency practices. It was an unprecedented move, and one that demanded an immediate internal review. The board had demanded answers. Chloe Green entered late, phone in hand, a practiced look of indignant confusion on her face. "I assume we're not here to entertain paranoid rumors," she said sharply. "This contract is too critical to let hearsay derail it." Gerald didn't respond. He looked toward the door just as it opened, and Danielle stepped into the room. She wore a charcoal gray pantsuit, clean lines, subtle gold accents, the kind of look that said she didn't borrow anyone's approval anymore. Her hair was pulled back neatly, her posture calm, her expression unreadable. She took a seat beside Gerald without asking. Chloe blinked. "Why is she here?" she demanded, her voice tightening. Gerald spoke before Danielle could. "She's here because the Saudis requested her presence, specifically, by name." The silence was instant. Chloe paled slightly but masked it with a forced scoff. "Seriously? This is absurd." Danielle opened a leather folder and laid 3 sheets of paper on the table. "There are concerns," she said clearly, "that merit attention, and evidence that some recent deals involved unethical practices, particularly related to how contracts were awarded, and which accounts were intentionally suppressed." "This is slander," Chloe snapped. "Coming from a disgruntled server?" Danielle didn't flinch. "Coming from someone who has spent 2 years watching you manipulate internal metrics, inflate budgets, and quietly eliminate diverse candidates before their resumes even reached final review." Gerald cleared his throat. "Danielle has provided records, documents, emails, and time-stamped audio clips." He connected his laptop to the projector. The screen came to life with a series of internal emails. Chloe's name prominently featured. One message showed her advising an intern to discard resumes from applicants with foreign-sounding names. Another revealed her altering presentation data to mislead an investor. "That's out of context," Chloe said, her voice suddenly cracking. "You don't understand the pressure I'm under to keep this company's image clean." "Clean?" Danielle replied. "You called it clean when you blocked 2 black applicants from internal promotions. You called it clean when you accused an Asian colleague of misreporting figures that you edited yourself." Chloe's mask began to crack. Her hands trembled as she tried to interject again, but the weight of the room had turned. Board members who once nodded politely now looked away in discomfort, or stared at her with thinly veiled disappointment. Mr. Sitter Owens, a senior partner and one of the original founders of Luxwell, finally spoke. "I've seen enough." His voice was quiet, but final. "Miss Green, please step out. Your access credentials will be suspended while legal reviews your conduct." Chloe stood, stunned. "You're going to believe her?" she whispered. "Over me?" Gerald looked at Danielle. "Yes," he said simply. "We are." And in that moment, it became clear to everyone in the room. Danielle Carter was no longer someone you could overlook. She was the voice of accountability, and the reason Luxwell might still have a future. Chloe's heels echoed through the hallway like a final act of denial, her red blazer fluttering as she was escorted out by security. No shouting, no final jab, just the slow, dawning realization that the walls she had built with arrogance and manipulation had finally caved in, and Danielle had been holding the blueprint all along. Back in the boardroom, silence settled like fog. No one quite knew what to say next. Gerald exhaled deeply, then looked around the table. "This company nearly lost a $300 million deal because of blind spots," he said. "Because we failed to recognize value outside of resumes and office titles. That ends today." He turned to Danielle. "Your insight didn't just protect us. It revealed what we were refusing to see. I'd like to formally offer you a position on the executive team, Director of Cross-Cultural Strategy." Danielle blinked. The offer was not a token. It was a real seat, a real voice. She met his gaze steadily. "I accept, on one condition." Gerald tilted his head. "Go on." "I want to build a mentorship program for underrepresented candidates within Luxwell. People who, like me, don't always get invited into the room, but deserve to be prepared when they finally are." Gerald nodded slowly, something like admiration in his eyes. "Done." As the board members murmured their agreement, Danielle sat back, not in triumph, but in quiet resolve. She hadn't taken down Chloe for revenge. She had done it for every voice that had been ignored, for every resume discarded for being too ethnic, for every intern told to wait their turn while watching others skip the line. Later that evening, she called her brother from the corner of her new office. "You remember when Mom said we come from quiet strength?" she asked. He chuckled. "Yeah, I thought it meant we had to stay silent." Danielle smiled. "No, it means we know when to speak, loud enough to be heard, but calm enough to be unstoppable." Through the glass window, the city shimmered. She had once delivered coffee to this floor. Now she was delivering change. 6 months later, Danielle stood before a packed auditorium in downtown Chicago, the Luxwell logo shining on a massive screen behind her, alongside the new emblem for the Rising Voices initiative. She had just finished delivering the keynote address for the company's first ever Inclusion and Equity Summit, an event she had envisioned, proposed, and brought to life from scratch. Executives, interns, partners, and press filled the room. But Danielle wasn't nervous. She was focused, calm, and absolutely in control. Her tailored navy suit reflected the professionalism she'd earned, but it was her tone, measured, confident, grounded, that held the room. "I used to walk these halls carrying trays," she told the crowd. "No one asked for my opinion. No one asked if I had ideas. But I listened. I learned. And when the time came, I spoke." She paused, letting her words land. "This company almost lost a $1 billion opportunity, not because we lacked talent, but because we failed to recognize it in places we weren't looking. My story isn't unique. It's just finally being seen." The room erupted in applause, but Danielle didn't smile for show. She smiled for something deeper, something earned. After the event, journalists gathered for interviews, young employees introduced themselves nervously, and a few veterans of the company shook her hand with unspoken apology in their eyes. Gerald approached her with a genuine smile. "You've tripled our Middle East portfolio," he said. "You've restructured our internal review system. And now, you're building the next generation of leaders. If I didn't know better, I'd say you're gunning for my job." Danielle laughed softly. "I'm not gunning for anything. I'm building something I never had." He nodded. "And changing the company while you're at it." That evening, as she returned to her apartment, a larger, sunlit unit overlooking Grant Park, she kicked off her heels and checked her inbox. One email stood out. Subject line, "Forbes feature approval. Danielle Carter to appear on Women Who Lead cover, September edition." She stared at it for a moment, then chuckled. It wasn't the recognition that moved her. It was the memory of the path that led there. The coffee trays, the whispered boardroom conversations, the moment she chose not to stay quiet. Across town, in a much smaller apartment in Oak Park, Chloe Green sat in front of her laptop, watching the summit replay on YouTube. Her face was expressionless, her eyes tired. She hadn't found work in months. The federal investigation had quietly closed with a settlement and a non-disclosure agreement, but her name was still whispered with caution in corporate circles. As Danielle's speech played on the screen, Chloe reached for her glass of wine, then paused. When Danielle spoke about quiet strength, something inside her flickered. Not resentment this time. Maybe something closer to recognition. Back at Luxwell, Danielle sat at her desk, now adorned with framed photos of her brother graduating college, her late mother smiling proudly, and a small hand-drawn note from one of the new interns that simply read, "Thank you for seeing me." She picked it up and held it gently. The real reward wasn't the corner office or the magazine cover. It was the fact that she had changed the way people looked at potential. She had proved that leadership doesn't always walk in through the front door. Sometimes it starts with a tray of coffee. Sometimes it walks quietly behind the noise. And when it finally speaks, it changes everything. A week after the summit, Danielle returned to where it all started, the catering service's back entrance at Luxwell's headquarters. She wasn't there to reminisce for nostalgia's sake. She had promised herself that when she finally reached the top, she'd make space for others to rise too. That promise began with the people who, like her, had once been invisible. She stepped through the staff corridor where carts rattled and trays clinked, where hurried footsteps had always kept her grounded in reality. The young woman currently managing the shift, a girl named Kiara, froze when she saw Danielle walk in wearing her executive badge and heels. "Ms. Carter?" she asked, wide-eyed, wiping her hands on her apron. Danielle smiled. "Just Danielle. I was hoping to talk to your team. 10 minutes tops." Kiara nodded, stunned, and gathered the staff in the break room. Around a small metal table sat the people who made Luxwell run every day without anyone noticing. Cleaners, food prep, supply handlers, security. They watched Danielle like she was a figure from a different world. "I'm not here to give a speech," Danielle began, leaning casually against the wall. "I just want to say thank you, and to tell you something no one told me when I was standing where you are." The room stayed quiet, eyes fixed on her. "You see everything," she said slowly. "You hear more than you think. And one day, what you know, what you've been quietly learning, might be the most valuable thing in the room." One of the older janitors, a man named Curtis, chuckled. "So you saying we're all future executives now?" Danielle grinned. "I'm saying don't underestimate yourselves just because someone else does." She took a stack of folders from her leather tote and placed them on the table. "This is the first round of internal mentorship applications. It's part of the Rising Voices program. Anyone here who's interested in learning finance, communications, compliance, you'll be paired with an executive mentor, including me." Kiara blinked. "Wait, seriously? Even us?" "Especially you," Danielle said. "We're not building a pipeline of privilege. We're building a pipeline of potential." As murmurs spread through the room, a quiet buzz of excitement replaced the usual resignation. Danielle didn't stay long. She knew this wasn't about one visit. It was about opening a door that had never even been visible before. She returned upstairs, where a team of junior analysts waited for her in the executive lounge. They were preparing for the upcoming joint venture pitch with a Korean investment group. One of them, a sharp young man named Emilio, leaned over. "Hey, Danielle, sorry if this is weird, but is it true you used to be on the catering staff?" Danielle met his gaze without flinching. "It's true," she said. "Why?" Emilio smiled, a little awkward. "Because it makes it easier to believe I could be sitting in your seat one day." Danielle paused, her expression softening. "Then let me be very clear," she replied. "I didn't get here in spite of where I started. I got here because of it. And you can, too." That night, she sat by her apartment window, sipping tea, watching the city lights shimmer below. She thought about the path she'd taken. Not perfect, not easy, but hers. From pouring coffee to pouring wisdom. From being overlooked to being undeniable. And somewhere out there, someone else was preparing, listening quietly, waiting for the moment the world would finally hear them. Danielle smiled to herself. She hoped they knew they weren't alone.